"I think I took the wrong trail." Those were the last confirmed words anyone ever heard from Emily Cross, and the strange part is, according to the GPS data on her phone, she hadn't. On the morning of October 11, 2021, 26-year-old Emily Cross arrived at Black Ridge State Park just after 8 a.m. The park sat deep in the Bitterroot Range of western Montana, nearly 40 miles from the nearest town and surrounded by more than 300 square miles of dense pine forest, glacial ravines, and steep granite slopes. It was the kind of place hikers described as beautiful during the day and deeply unsettling once the sun started to disappear behind the mountains. Emily had been there before. That detail matters because this wasn't some reckless tourist wandering off into unfamiliar wilderness. She was experienced, cautious, and according to everyone who knew her, almost obsessive about preparation. She carried extra batteries, printed maps, emergency blankets, even backup water filters. Friends later told investigators that Emily was the type of person who checked weather reports twice before driving to the grocery store. Which is why what happened next made so little sense. Surveillance footage from a gas station roughly 12 miles outside the park showed Emily buying coffee and speaking casually with the clerk at approximately 8:17 a.m. Nothing appeared unusual. She looked calm, rested, and completely normal. Her phone records showed several outgoing texts to friends discussing dinner plans later that evening. At 9:03 a.m., she passed through the northern trailhead entrance. Rangers later confirmed her vehicle, a silver Subaru Outback, was parked exactly where it should have been. Inside the car they found an extra jacket, a small cooler, and a handwritten checklist of hiking supplies with every item crossed off. The trail Emily planned to hike was known as the Cedar Pass Loop, a 7-mile route considered moderate difficulty. Under normal conditions, it took around 4 hours to complete. Even accounting for photo stops and breaks, Emily should have returned to her car before sunset. She never did. At 1:42 p.m., Emily placed a phone call to her friend Rachel Moore. The call lasted only 27 seconds, but investigators would replay it for months afterward. At first, nothing sounded strange. Wind could be heard in the background along with the faint crunch of gravel underfoot. Emily's voice sounded calm, though slightly distracted. Then she said something that immediately caught Rachel's attention. "I think I took the wrong trail." Rachel later asked what she meant because the Cedar Pass Loop was clearly marked and difficult to leave accidentally. Emily hesitated for a moment before responding quietly, "I don't know, the markers look different now." Then the line went silent. Not disconnected. Silent. A few seconds later the call ended entirely. Now here's where things stop making sense. GPS metadata recovered from Emily's phone later showed that during the call, she was still standing less than half a mile from the main trail. In fact, according to the coordinates, she was technically still on the correct path. Search and rescue officials would later say there was no obvious reason for her to feel lost at all. But Emily did feel lost. And after that phone call, something changed. At 2:11 p.m., her phone pinged one final time near an overlook called Raven's Shelf, a narrow ridge sitting above a heavily wooded ravine. Then the signal vanished completely. No more texts. No more calls. No emergency beacon. Just silence. And by the time the sun disappeared behind the Bitterroots that evening, Emily Cross had seemingly disappeared with it. At first, investigators believed this was going to be a routine missing hiker case. People disappear in national parks more often than most Americans realize, and in the overwhelming majority of situations there is eventually a logical explanation. A wrong turn. Sudden weather exposure. A fall nobody witnessed. Search teams recover the missing person, reconstruct the timeline, and piece together what happened. But almost immediately, this case began resisting that process. Emily's parents reported her missing shortly after midnight when repeated calls went straight to voicemail and park officials confirmed her vehicle was still sitting untouched at the Cedar Pass trailhead. Rangers launched the initial search operation at 4:30 the next morning. Temperatures overnight had dropped into the upper 30s, and a low-pressure system had settled across the Bitterroot Range, covering most of the higher elevations in dense morning fog. Visibility in some sections of the park had fallen below 20 feet. Veteran search personnel later described the conditions as disorienting but survivable, the kind of weather that could easily confuse an inexperienced hiker but should not have completely overwhelmed someone like Emily. By sunrise, over 30 people were involved in the search effort, including volunteers, local deputies, park rangers, and 2 canine tracking teams. The first strange detail emerged less than an hour later. Emily's scent trail was extremely easy to follow at first. Dogs tracked her movement from the parking area through the northern section of Cedar Pass exactly as expected. Footprints matching her boots were also discovered along a muddy incline roughly 2 miles into the trail. Everything suggested she had remained on course. Then, near an area known locally as Timber Hollow, the scent abruptly stopped. Not weakened. Not scattered. Stopped. One of the handlers later described the dog's reaction as unusual because instead of continuing forward or circling outward like they normally would when a scent faded naturally, both animals reportedly became agitated and kept returning to the same narrow patch of ground near the edge of the trail. Investigators searched the surrounding area extensively. They found nothing. No torn clothing. No signs of a fall. No disturbed brush. Nothing to indicate Emily had left the trail willingly or otherwise. And yet beyond that point, there was no clear evidence she had continued walking either. What made the situation even stranger was the terrain itself. Timber Hollow was not some remote backcountry wilderness miles away from civilization. It sat less than 3 miles from the main entrance and only a short distance from a ranger service road. In theory, Emily should have been easy to locate. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging swept over the surrounding forest that afternoon. Volunteers searched ravines and drainage basins. Rangers repeatedly called out her name through portable loudspeakers hoping for any response. There was only silence. Then investigators discovered something else that complicated the timeline even further. Data pulled from Emily's fitness watch showed her heart rate suddenly spiking at approximately 2:07 p.m., just minutes before her phone emitted its final signal near Raven's Shelf. The increase lasted less than 60 seconds before the device stopped transmitting entirely. At first glance, that might sound explainable. A steep climb could elevate heart rate. Panic could too. But according to the elevation profile of the trail, Emily should have been walking through relatively flat terrain during that exact period. There was no difficult incline nearby. No dangerous crossing. No obvious reason for sudden physical distress. And perhaps the strangest part of all was this: despite the growing urgency of the search, nobody reported hearing Emily call for help. Not a single hiker. Not a single camper. Nothing. It was as if somewhere between Timber Hollow and Raven's Shelf, the wilderness had simply swallowed the sound with her. The longer the search continued, the stranger the mountain seemed to become. By the third day, nearly 80 people had joined the operation. Additional canine teams arrived from Missoula along with state search and rescue personnel trained specifically for wilderness recovery. Rangers established temporary command posts near the Cedar Pass entrance, and drones equipped with infrared cameras began sweeping sections of forest too dense for helicopters to properly observe. On paper, this was exactly the kind of coordinated response designed to prevent a tragedy. And yet despite covering miles of terrain repeatedly, investigators still could not explain one very basic question: where had Emily actually gone? Then came the photograph. Late on the evening of October 14th, detectives examining Emily's phone backup recovered an image timestamped just 11 minutes before her final call to Rachel. At first glance, the picture appeared completely ordinary. It showed a section of trail line, with pine trees beneath heavy cloud cover. But something about it bothered investigators almost immediately. The trail marker visible in the background did not belong anywhere near Raven's Shelf. In fact, according to park maps, that specific marker design had only been installed along an older maintenance route nearly 6 miles east of Emily's intended path. Initially, authorities assumed the timestamp was corrupted. That explanation would have made sense except for one problem. Metadata from the image matched the rest of the phone's records perfectly. The coordinates embedded within the file still placed Emily near Raven's shelf at the exact moment the photo was taken. Somehow, the location data and the visual evidence contradicted each other entirely. Investigators considered the possibility that the image had been altered automatically by the phone's software or improperly uploaded during cloud synchronization. Digital analysts later rejected both theories. As far as anyone could determine, the photograph was authentic. And that raised an uncomfortable possibility. Either Emily had somehow traveled miles off course in an impossibly short amount of time, or she had encountered a trail marker that should not have been there at all. Rangers familiar with the area found that explanation deeply unsettling because Black Ridge State Park had a reputation for confusing terrain even under good conditions. Unlike the wide scenic trails tourists usually imagine, large portions of Cedar Pass narrowed into twisting corridors between rock formations and dense timber. Fog often settled unevenly across the mountain, creating visual distortions that could make distances feel inconsistent. Experienced hikers described certain sections as directionally deceptive, especially during overcast weather when sunlight could not penetrate the canopy. But even then, the park was not considered especially dangerous. People got turned around occasionally. They did not usually vanish without leaving evidence behind. Then another detail surfaced. Around 3:30 p.m. on the day Emily disappeared, a married couple hiking roughly 2 miles south of Timber Hollow reported hearing what they initially believed was someone calling from deeper within the forest. The sound was faint and difficult to understand because of shifting wind conditions, but both later described it as a woman's voice. The strange part was not the sound itself. It was the direction. According to their statements, the voice seemed to come from an area with no established trails at all, a steep section of densely wooded ravine locals referred to as Hollow Creek Basin. Search teams immediately redirected resources there the following morning. They found no footprints. No discarded equipment. No signs anyone had recently passed through the area. One ranger later admitted the basin itself felt unnervingly isolated despite being relatively close to the main trail system. Thick tree cover blocked most natural light, and radio communication became unreliable inside the ravine due to the surrounding granite walls. Even during daylight hours, visibility inside parts of Hollow Creek Basin reportedly dropped low enough that searchers struggled to maintain visual contact with one another at distances greater than 30 feet. And somewhere inside that growing confusion, investigators began realizing they might not be searching the right place at all. Then investigators discovered the gap. Not a gap in the trail, not a gap in the weather reports, but a gap in time itself. During the first week of the investigation, analysts reconstructed every available movement connected to Emily's final hours. They reviewed traffic cameras outside the park, phone metadata, fitness tracker information, ranger logs, and witness statements. Initially the sequence seemed straightforward. Emily entered Cedar Pass shortly after 9 in the morning. She moved north along the main loop trail. Her fitness watch recorded a steady walking pace for nearly 4 hours. Then, at approximately 1:18 p.m., the data became erratic. Over the next 47 minutes, Emily's recorded movement no longer matched the geography of the mountain. According to her watch, she covered nearly 3.5 miles through terrain that should have taken at least 2 hours to cross on foot. Rangers familiar with Black Ridge immediately flagged the data as impossible. Portions of that route included steep elevation changes, loose shale, and dense timber thick enough to force hikers into single-file movement. Even experienced climbers would have struggled to move that quickly, especially under worsening weather conditions. At first, investigators assumed the watch had malfunctioned. Consumer GPS devices are not perfectly accurate in mountainous terrain. Signal bouncing caused by canyon walls and tree cover can distort positioning data. But once again, there was a problem with that explanation. The device had tracked Emily's movements with near-perfect consistency earlier that same morning. Only during that unexplained 47-minute window did the anomalies appear. And there was something else. Her heart rate patterns during the gap did not align with extreme physical exertion. Instead of showing a sustained elevated rhythm consistent with running or climbing, the data fluctuated unpredictably. Sharp spikes. Sudden drops. Long stretches where the readings became strangely irregular before stabilizing again. One analyst later compared the pattern to someone repeatedly stopping and reorienting themselves in confusion. The implication was unsettling because it suggested Emily may not have been moving intentionally at all. Then came the weather reports. Meteorologists reviewing the conditions that afternoon identified a rapid fog inversion moving through the Bitterroot Range between approximately 1 o'clock and 2 p.m. These inversions occur when colder air becomes trapped beneath warmer layers higher up the mountain, creating sudden walls of dense ground fog that can appear almost without warning. Hikers inside them often report severe disorientation because visibility collapses unevenly. Distances become difficult to judge. Sounds echo unpredictably. Familiar landmarks can disappear entirely within seconds. Rangers acknowledged that such conditions could explain why Emily felt lost despite technically remaining close to the main trail. But again, the theory did not fully hold together. Search teams later recreated the conditions using the same route, the same visibility estimates, and similar weather patterns. Even under poor conditions, volunteers consistently emerged back onto the trail within minutes. Nobody drifted 6 miles off course. Nobody vanished entirely. And perhaps most disturbing of all was what investigators discovered near Hollow Creek Basin late on October 18, buried beneath damp pine needles near a cluster of fallen trees. Searchers located one of Emily's hiking poles. At first this seemed like a breakthrough. Finally, physical evidence. But the location immediately raised new questions. The pole was found nearly 4 miles east of Raven's Shelf in an area so steep and heavily wooded that multiple rangers admitted they had initially considered it inaccessible to casual hikers. There were no matching footprints nearby. No disturbed earth. No indication of a campsite or prolonged activity. Just the pole itself resting against a tree as though it had been deliberately placed there. Search dogs brought to the site reacted almost identically to the way they had near Timber Hollow. They tracked Emily's scent briefly, circled the immediate area several times, and then abruptly stopped. No continuation. No clear direction. It was as though the trail simply ended in the middle of the forest. By the second week, the investigation had split into 2 completely different camps. The first group believed the explanation was ultimately simple, even if tragic. They argued that Emily had become disoriented during the fog inversion, wandered off trail, and succumbed somewhere deep within the Bitterroot wilderness before search teams could locate her. On the surface, that theory made sense. Exposure remains one of the leading causes of death in wilderness disappearances across North America, and people experiencing panic or environmental confusion often make irrational decisions. Rangers pointed to multiple historical cases where experienced hikers had unknowingly walked in circles or traveled far beyond expected distances while attempting to reorient themselves. But the deeper investigators looked into Emily's movements, the harder it became to fit her disappearance neatly into that framework. For one thing, Emily had survival training. Friends described her as intensely methodical outdoors. She carried emergency equipment specifically designed for overnight exposure, including thermal layers, water purification tablets, and a compact emergency shelter. Searchers also never found any evidence suggesting she attempted to build a fire, establish a campsite, or leave trail markers behind. Experienced hikers lost in the wilderness generally try to increase visibility and remain stationary once they realize they are disoriented. Emily appeared to have done neither. Then there was the issue of the distances involved. Analysts reviewing her GPS data concluded that even if every anomalous movement recorded by her watch were accepted as accurate, the terrain itself should have slowed her dramatically. Yet several data points implied movement speeds that bordered on impossible for someone alone on foot in deteriorating weather. One search coordinator later admitted privately that portions of the timeline looked less like a hiker navigating rough terrain and more like someone being relocated between points. Officially, investigators rejected that characterization. Publicly, they continued emphasizing environmental explanations. But behind the scenes, the contradictions were piling up. Then came the witness near Timber Hollow. 6 days after Emily vanished, park authorities released a request for information involving an unidentified older male hiker reportedly seen in the area around the same time as Emily. According to multiple witness statements, the man appeared to be in his late 50s or early 60s, wearing dark outdoor clothing and carrying what one witness described as an old-fashioned external frame backpack. That detail stood out because external frame packs had largely fallen out of use decades earlier. More unsettling was the fact that nobody could provide a consistent description of his face. One hiker claimed he had a gray beard. Another insisted he was clean-shaven. A third witness said the man wore a brimmed hat low enough to obscure most of his features entirely. Investigators initially considered him a potentially important witness who may have crossed paths with Emily somewhere along Cedar Pass. But despite reviewing entrance logs, surveillance footage, nearby gas station recordings, and campground registrations, authorities were never able to identify him. No vehicle connected to the description appeared entering or leaving the park that day. It was almost as if he had simply materialized somewhere inside the mountain itself. Skeptics later argued this mystery was likely exaggerated by media attention and memory contamination. Once news coverage began circulating descriptions of a strange man on the trail, witnesses may have unconsciously reshaped their recollections to fit the growing narrative. Psychologists acknowledge that phenomenon happens frequently during high-profile investigations. But again, there was a problem. The earliest ranger notes referencing the unidentified hiker were written before the story reached local media. Witnesses had mentioned him independently almost immediately after the search began. And then investigators discovered something they had somehow missed during the initial sweep of Emily's vehicle. Folded inside the glove compartment was a printed topographic map of Black Ridge State Park with one specific section circled repeatedly in red ink. Not Cedar Pass. Not Raven's Shelf. Hollow Creek Basin. That discovery changed the entire direction of the investigation. Until that moment, Hollow Creek Basin had been treated as a secondary search zone, an isolated ravine connected to the case mostly through uncertain witness reports and the faint sound supposedly heard by hikers on the afternoon Emily disappeared. But now investigators had proof that Emily herself had been interested in the area before she ever entered the park. The question was why. Detectives interviewed friends, co-workers, and family members hoping someone could explain the markings on the map. At first nobody could. Emily had never mentioned Hollow Creek Basin directly to her parents, and none of her hiking partners recalled her discussing plans to explore off-trail sections of Black Ridge. Then one of her co-workers remembered a conversation from roughly 2 weeks earlier. According to her statement, Emily had become fascinated with old fire. Lookout routes scattered throughout the Bitterroot Range after reading about abandoned ranger stations online. Most of those locations had long since disappeared from official maps, but remnants still existed deep in the forests and mountains across western Montana. Some had collapsed decades ago. Others had simply been reclaimed by the wilderness itself. Hollow Creek Basin, it turned out, was connected to one of those forgotten routes. Park archives later confirmed that before Black Ridge became a protected recreation area in the late 1970s, a narrow maintenance trail once cut through the basin toward an observation point called Granite Overlook. Rangers stopped maintaining the route after repeated landslides and erosion made sections unsafe. Over time, nature swallowed most of it entirely. Trees collapsed across the path. Flooding reshaped portions of the ravine. By the early 2000s, the trail had effectively vanished from public maps altogether. But traces still remained if someone knew where to look. That detail immediately raised another possibility. Maybe Emily had not become lost accidentally at all. Maybe she had intentionally attempted to locate the abandoned route. The theory explains several strange elements at once, including the map markings, the unusual GPS movements, and the witness reports placing sounds deeper within Hollow Creek Basin. Yet once again, the explanation created new contradictions almost immediately. If Emily had deliberately entered the basin searching for the old trail, why did she sound confused during her final phone call? More importantly, why would an experienced hiker knowingly attempt an off-trail route alone during deteriorating weather conditions without mentioning it to anyone beforehand? Friends described her as adventurous but careful. Reckless behavior simply did not fit her personality. Then investigators uncovered something even stranger buried within archived ranger reports dating back nearly 20 years. Since the early 1990s, there had been multiple incidents involving hikers becoming disoriented near Hollow Creek Basin despite remaining physically close to established trails. In most cases, the individuals were eventually located unharmed. But the similarities between their accounts were difficult to ignore. Several described sudden fog rolling through the ravine without warning. Others reported becoming convinced they were walking in the wrong direction even while standing on marked paths. One hiker claimed trail markers appeared to move between sections of the forest. Another described hearing distant voices despite being completely alone. Rangers officially attributed these experiences to environmental stress, isolation, and terrain confusion caused by the basin's unusual geography. Hollow Creek sat inside a natural acoustic pocket created by steep granite walls and dense timber, conditions capable of distorting sound in unpredictable ways. Combined with shifting fog and limited visibility, the area could apparently create an intense sense of spatial disorientation. Logically, that explanation made sense. But then there was the photograph again. Analysts comparing Emily's final image against historical park records eventually identified the exact trail marker visible in the background. It belonged to the abandoned granite overlook route inside Hollow Creek Basin. There was no ambiguity anymore. Somehow, shortly before vanishing, Emily had reached a location that should have been miles away from where her phone claimed she was standing. And the deeper investigators pushed into the basin searching for answers, the more the mountain seemed determined not to give them any. By late October, the search operation had become less about rescue and more about reconstruction. Investigators no longer believed they were dealing with a simple navigation mistake. There were too many inconsistencies, too many points where the evidence seemed to fracture instead of align. And nowhere was that more obvious than inside Hollow Creek Basin itself. Rangers assigned to search the abandoned granite overlook route began reporting unusual navigation issues almost immediately. Not supernatural events, not impossible phenomena, but small persistent problems that became increasingly difficult to ignore. GPS devices occasionally drifted off established coordinates. Radio signals weakened unpredictably near certain rock formations. Compass readings fluctuated enough that several teams began relying primarily on physical trail markers instead of electronic navigation. Officially, none of this was considered extraordinary. Granite-rich terrain is known to interfere with magnetic instruments under specific conditions, and steep canyon walls can distort satellite positioning. But what unsettled many of the searchers was how inconsistent the effects appeared to be. One section of the basin would function normally while another, only a few hundred yards away, seemed strangely unreliable. Then came the ranger audio recording. On October 23, two search personnel conducting a grid sweep near the old granite overlook route activated a body camera while moving through dense fog conditions shortly after sunrise. The footage itself showed nothing unusual beyond limited visibility and difficult terrain. But roughly 17 minutes into the recording, one of the rangers abruptly stopped walking. He later claimed he heard what sounded like someone speaking somewhere deeper within the trees. At first the audio seemed too distorted to analyze clearly. Wind moved through the ravine constantly, and the basin's natural acoustics created echoes that often resembled distant voices. However, forensic enhancement performed weeks later isolated a faint sequence of sounds lasting approximately 4 seconds. Some investigators believed it resembled a woman calling for help. Others argued the audio was nothing more than environmental interference interpreted through expectation bias. Even today, opinions remain divided about what exactly the recording contains. But what happened immediately afterward is far more difficult to dismiss. According to GPS tracking data, the two rangers unintentionally separated from the rest of their search grid for nearly 20 minutes despite remaining within a relatively confined area. Both later described becoming convinced they were walking uphill toward the ridge line when in reality they had drifted nearly half a mile deeper into Hollow Creek Basin. One of them later admitted that during the incident, the forest itself began to feel wrong in a way he struggled to properly articulate. Not threatening exactly. Just disorienting. Familiar landmarks appeared repetitive. Distances felt distorted. He claimed that at one point he became certain they had already passed the same fallen tree multiple times. Again, psychologists reviewing the case pointed toward environmental stress and sensory confusion. Dense fog combined with visual monotony can absolutely create those effects, especially in isolated wilderness conditions. Rationally, that explanation holds together. But then investigators uncovered something hidden within the old park maintenance archives that complicated matters yet again. Nearly 30 years earlier, before the Granite Overlook route was officially abandoned, a seasonal ranger named Thomas Bell submitted an incident report describing repeated navigation anomalies inside Hollow Creek Basin. Bell wrote that hikers occasionally reported walking farther than intended without realizing it, and experiencing sudden confusion regarding trail orientation. Most unsettling of all, he specifically referenced one section of the basin where visitors repeatedly claimed trail markers appeared out of place. Supervisors at the time dismissed the report as exaggerated and attributed the complaints to weather conditions and poor trail maintenance. No formal action was ever taken. But reading the document decades later, investigators noticed something difficult to ignore. The language Bell used describing those misplaced markers sounded remarkably similar to Emily's final phone call. The markers looked different now. That sentence kept resurfacing throughout the investigation like a loose thread nobody could fully pull apart. Because if Emily truly believed the trail itself had somehow changed around her, then whatever happened during those final 47 minutes may have started long before anyone realized she was missing. Then, almost a month after Emily vanished, investigators found the camera. It happened on November 6 during what officials described as a final targeted sweep of Hollow Creek Basin before winter conditions forced the search. Operation to scale back permanently. Snow had already begun settling across the upper ridges of Black Ridge State Park, and temperatures overnight regularly dropped below freezing. Most volunteers had gone home by then. Media attention was fading. Publicly, authorities still maintained optimism, but privately many involved in the case were beginning to accept that they might never fully reconstruct what happened on the mountain. The camera changed that. A volunteer searcher discovered it lodged beneath a fallen pine roughly 300 yards east of the abandoned Granite Overlook route. At first glance, the device appeared heavily weathered but intact. Investigators quickly confirmed it belonged to Emily. It was the same mirrorless digital camera friends said she carried on nearly every hiking trip. Curiously, despite weeks of rain, fog, and freezing temperatures, the memory card remained readable. And what investigators found on it only deepened the mystery. The earliest photos matched Emily's known route through Cedar Pass exactly as expected. Scenic overlooks. Tree lines. Mist settling across distant ridges. Nothing unusual. But beginning shortly after 1 p.m., the images started changing in subtle ways. Several photographs showed sections of trail investigators could not immediately identify. Others appeared blurred, as though taken while moving quickly through dense timber. One image in particular became central to the investigation. Time-stamped at 1:36 p.m., it depicted a narrow stretch of overgrown path descending into heavy fog. Near the center of the frame stood a weathered wooden trail marker partially obscured by moss. Analysts later confirmed it belonged to the abandoned Granite Overlook route. But what unsettled investigators was not the marker itself. It was the perspective. The image appeared to have been taken from farther inside Hollow Creek Basin than Emily should have physically been able to reach by that time according to every available timeline. Again, the distances simply did not work. Then investigators noticed something else. In the corner of several photographs taken during the final 47-minute window, there appeared to be a dark vertical shape partially obscured by trees. Initially, digital analysts dismissed it as a lighting artifact caused by fog and shadow distortion. But as more images were enhanced, the shape appeared repeatedly from different angles and distances. It never became fully visible. Sometimes it resembled a tree trunk. Other times almost a person standing near the edge of the frame. Importantly, investigators never officially identified it as another individual. Publicly, authorities warned against speculation and emphasized how easily fog conditions can distort depth perception and create misleading visual patterns. Rationally, they were correct. Human brains constantly attempt to impose recognizable forms onto ambiguous imagery. But the repeated appearance of the shape continued bothering analysts because Emily herself seemed increasingly focused on whatever she was photographing. The final image on the camera was taken at 1:41 p.m., less than 1 minute before her call to Rachel. Unlike the earlier photographs, this one was almost completely blurred as though captured while the camera was being lowered suddenly. Most of the frame showed only streaks of gray fog and dark timber. But audio recovered from the camera's internal recording system captured something unexpected in the background. Footsteps. Not Emily's. Distinct secondary footsteps crunching against wet gravel several seconds behind her own. Investigators enhanced the recording repeatedly hoping to isolate additional sounds. They found no voices. No confrontation. No clear evidence of another person. Only the rhythmic sound of someone else moving somewhere behind her within the fog. Skeptics later argued the audio could easily represent delayed echo effects created by the basin's unusual acoustics. Search personnel familiar with Hollow Creek acknowledged that possibility immediately. In certain weather conditions, the ravine could distort sound badly enough to create the illusion of movement where none existed. But even those explanations failed to answer one critical question. If Emily truly was alone during those final moments, who or what was she repeatedly turning the camera toward? After the discovery of the camera, official investigators attempted to pull the case back toward a conventional explanation. Public pressure had grown intense by that point, and online speculation surrounding Hollow Creek Basin was beginning to spiral into increasingly bizarre territory. Some people claimed the abandoned granite overlook route sat near undocumented cave systems beneath the mountain. Others insisted the strange navigation reports pointed toward magnetic anomalies or government activity hidden somewhere inside Black Ridge State Park. A few fringe theories even suggested supernatural explanations tied to old regional folklore. Rangers pushed back against all of it. They emphasized that wilderness environments are fully capable of creating fear and confusion without anything paranormal occurring at all. In many ways, they were right. Studies on spatial disorientation in remote terrain show that dense forests combined with uneven topography and low visibility can severely distort human perception. People naturally drift while walking, especially without visible reference points. Sound reflects unpredictably in narrow ravines. Fog reduces depth perception and alters scale. Under stress, the brain begins filling informational gaps with assumptions that may not match reality. Logically, nearly every strange element in the case had a possible explanation when viewed individually. The misplaced trail markers could have resulted from abandoned maintenance work. The GPS inconsistencies could have been caused by signal drift within the basin's granite walls. The voices heard by hikers and rangers might have been acoustic distortion. Even the secondary footsteps captured on Emily's camera audio could theoretically represent echoes bouncing through the ravine. The problem was not any single detail. The problem was how all of them overlapped. Because taken together, the contradictions created a timeline that still refused to fully settle into place. Then came the weather reconstruction. In December of 2021, investigators partnered with atmospheric specialists from the University of Montana to digitally recreate environmental conditions inside Hollow Creek Basin on the day Emily disappeared. Their findings introduced yet another disturbing layer to the case. According to the reconstruction, the fog inversion moving through Black Ridge that afternoon was unusually severe even by local standards. Temperature shifts inside the basin created dense rolling pockets of low visibility capable of forming and collapsing within minutes. Under certain conditions, someone standing less than 50 feet away could disappear completely from view. More importantly, the simulations demonstrated how sound inside Hollow Creek Basin could behave unpredictably due to the shape of the surrounding terrain. Voices could appear to originate from entirely different directions. Footsteps could echo at delayed intervals. A person might genuinely believe someone was following them even while completely alone. To many investigators, that seemed like the final missing piece. Emily likely entered the abandoned granite overlook route intentionally, became disoriented inside the fog inversion, panicked as environmental distortions intensified around her, and eventually wandered into inaccessible terrain beyond the reach of search teams. Rationally, it is probably the most plausible explanation available. But even that theory left several critical questions unresolved. Why did her GPS